An intimidating microphone in the middle. Yeah, just ask anything.
Well, before Vendetta, I did all kinds of things in British comics. I wasn't working in American comics before Vendetta. And I think you might be interested to know that Vendetta was actually inspired by something I did for a British division of Marvel. Marvel UK issued a comic called Hulk Weekly, which was launched to capitalize on the Incredible Hulk TV show. And the idea was to make it like a British comic. And British comics at the time were like cheap newsprint stuff. And the idea was to actually produce, I think there's Paul here now. I'll just finish. The idea was to produce a comic that was like a British comic, and with Hulk stories and stuff like that, and also some new British stuff, British characters. And one of the characters I did for that was a masked vigilante character called Night Raven. And he was a crime fighter fighting in Prohibition America. And the editor of that comic, when he left Marvel at a later stage and set up his own magazine, a magazine called Warrior, which was an independent black and white, he wanted me to do something similar, a masked vigilante crime fighter. And basically, that became V. So that's a part of the V before that is relevant to what I did. So, okay.
Right, I'm going to carry on typing at this point and desperately hope that we do get the connection. But I'd like to thank you very much indeed for coming. My name's Leonard Sultana. I blog under the title An Englishman in San Diego. And I'm a relative newcomer to San Diego Comic-Con. This is only my 7th. Certainly not of the caliber and of the guests that I've got with me today. When I went to my first one, I actually set up a UK attendees group called The British Invasion, Spirit of 86. And the reason why I called it that is because it was named after a period in comics which I find fascinating. That period in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where an influx of incredible talent was strip-mined from the UK talent pool and brought over to the US. Ideally, I would have you clap all of them, and including my other guests as well at the end, but I think we'll go one at a time and you can welcome them along. We are joined by former president of DC Comics, Mr. Paul Levitz, which I'm sure needs no introduction. And we also have as well as myself, 2 other Brits in the room, which means, by the way, there will be no subtitles during the course of this panel. So unfortunately, you are just going to have to bear with the British accent for certainly my other 2 guests. In the middle there, we have Eisner nominated. We have a gentleman who I have been considering the new Neil Gaiman, and certainly with his recent works. Yes.
Okay, I'm sitting here wearing all black, I know, but it's... that is true.
The thing is, if I keep repeating it as well, he's never going to get his head out those doors, so it's going to be cool. But nominated for, obviously, with The Wicked and Divine, which is a stunning book out at the moment, Mr. Kieran Gillen, everyone. And at the end, a gentleman who also really doesn't need too much of an introduction when all you have to do is mention V for Vendetta, which is certainly his landmark book, but he has certainly been somebody who has been at the vanguard of digital comics and remains a comics legend in my mind, certainly. Mr. David Lloyd. So what we're talking about is that bringing over of British talent to the UK. I mean, I think we'll set the tone and the stage first. What was the tone of American comics at that time, in sort of like 76 to 79, certainly the early 80s? What was the tone of comics? I mean, was it optimistic? Was it coming off that the campy element of the 1960s? What was the tone of the comics at that time? Paul.
if you're talking, the period of the British invasion story really begins close to a decade before what you've identified as the title here. When you're looking at the late 1970s in American comics, the tone of the material was fairly chipper. We were writing comics for kids. The assumption was that 12-year-olds, maybe bright 12-year-olds, maybe a smattering of 16 and 17-year-olds, a couple of college kids were reading the comics. But basically, comics were still being sold on the newsstand, and it was a kid's medium. Many of us had grown up on it, loving it, and we're trying to do maybe a little more adventurous stuff than had been done before. But the direct market was tiny. It represented, at that point, probably 5% of the comic book business going through the comic shops. 95% was going through newsstands. The newsstands were doing horribly. American newsstands were starting to fade away. The comic publishers were afraid they were going to fade away with them. So the books may have been chipper, but the people working in the business were not particularly.
Fair enough. Well, that also then leads us to the question, what was the tone of the comics industry in the UK? At that point, we were talking about Fleetway. Certainly 2000 AD was the large title and the most popular title at that time.
You're picking up the story too late in the story,
okay.
Leonard.
No, in that case, sir? Please, let's go further back.
So the connection to Britain, between Britain and the U.S., really goes back to the early 1970s. And it starts in many ways with a couple of young British comic fans who were putting out a magazine called Comic Media, which was sort of a news fanzine. And they contacted an American comic fan who was putting out what was at the time the dominant American news fanzine, The Comic Reader, that would be me, and said, can we please have the right to reprint some of the news from your magazine in our magazine? I don't think they really needed the right, but none of us knew what the hell the law was, and none of us were adults yet anyway. The two guys doing Comic Media were Nick Landau and Richard Burton. Nick went on to be one of the founders of both Forbidden Planet, the retail chain, and Titan Distributors, the principal British distributor of comics for many years before it sold out to Diamond, and Titan Books, which is a major publisher. Both Nick and Richard, prior to Nick founding those businesses, served as assistant editors on 2000 AD.
Mm-hmm.
They were both, Richard was a robot sidekick for Tharg for a bunch of years. But the relationship that we built off that material was really one of the first connections between American and British fandom turning professional. So prior to 2000 AD being out there, I was starting to see, was it Tornado? Whatever the guys were starting to work on in the early stages of their careers, and we were beginning to build up connections between them. In '79, the Science Fiction Worldcon was held in Brighton, England, and it was held about a week after one of the early British comic conventions. I forget whether it was in I think it was in Manchester.
Yeah.
And a bunch of us went over. So you had Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, myself, Joe Staten and his wife Hillary were spending that entire summer in England. Hillary was a school teacher in those years. Joe was drawing comics for DC. Joe, because he was spending time over there, still needed to do his freelance assignments and needed a place to work. And through these web of contacts, had gotten hooked up with a young British artist named Brian Bolland. And he spent that summer working in Brian's studio. That's how Brian got to do his first covers for DC. It was through Joe connecting him with Jack Harris, who was editing Green Lantern, I think, at the time. And that trip created a lot of the acquaintanceships that became the first steps towards the British invasion. Now, was it a case of them staying here in the UK? And because I understand there was a lot of mailing backwards and forwards with. Oh yeah, nobody came over. Right?
No.
Everything was sent by whatever the primitive equivalent of FedEx was.
Okay.
The please Lord let it get here express.
Okay. So let's talk about that time then, David, when it came to what was the tone of the British comics and the tone at that time. Because, like I said, I was talking 2000 AD, but like you say, yeah, they go further back. Was it still very much a dark tone or very Boys Own Mag kind of element to it?
No, British comics had moved out of the Boys Own mode very, very greatly. Around about the time that Paulie's talking about, 2000 AD was the revolution, really, in British comics. There was, the people like Pat Mills, the great writer Pat Mills, were really taking risks with comics, British comics. And it happened because the publishers were letting them have their heads. 2000 AD happened by accident, really. They were just, the British publishers, and this is one of the things to bear in mind about the reason why all the British came over to America. British comics publishers, had no faith in the fact that comics could be mature and edgy kind of medium and creatively develop. They were not interested in that, and in fact that lasted right up until the 80s and beyond, which is why everybody came and worked for DC. People who were really interested in the creative evolution of comics. But because those British publishers were so apathetic about the medium and the product, their editors were given their heads, and they took the chance to do whatever they wanted to. So you had some really edgy stuff, like a comic called Action, which was, incredibly violent and gory, in that kind of healthy, cheerful, blood and thunder, grand guignol sort of manner that kids love and teenagers love. And that was, but the big turning point was 2000 AD, which, appropriately enough, was released in the same year, was published in the same year as Star Wars, 1977. So it was a seminal year in many ways.
Back when 2000 AD felt like such a long, long way away.
And that was Steve McManus, who was the original editor on 2000 AD, wasn't it?
I think so, yes, that's right.
Much under-celebrated name in the history.
Yeah, he was one of the sort of pioneers, yeah. But that was, so the mood was dark, though. It was, it was dark and cynical and very political, even then. Yeah. Judge Dredd is sort of like a fascist of the future. Basically, kind of Clint Eastwood style, sort of like Dirty Harry of Mega City, and it's important to remember. Just something else, just to add to 2000 AD, and also the creators at the time. My generation, Dave Gibbons, Brian Bolland, all that crowd, we were heavily influenced by American television and American comics. Completely different from the generation that was before us, which was kind of an old-fashioned comic strip artist crew. We were very heavily influenced by American movies, American comics, and it was blended into the English, British
sensibility.
Sensibility, that's the word.
And also the particular structure of how the stories were told made a real difference, because you were still doing almost all 4- and 5-page weekly segments of stories, which is totally unlike anything we ever did in America. Yeah. So that necessitated a kind of fast pace and choppy approach to it, which was a very different style of writing.
Absolutely. It was this cliffhanger concept.
Yeah.
Like serials. And they were weekly.
I was just about to say 2000 AD was a weekly comic. It was certainly churning it out and to get the work on the page, and it was certainly a hotbed of talent at that time. So in this particular love affair, who made the first move, Paul, would you say? Did you actively come over looking for talent, or were you basically just attending the UK cons to
Oh, the UK cons,
Yeah.
we were there as
Yeah,
fans.
yeah, yeah.
That wasn't an expense account or anything like that. That was just, I had as much fun getting to visit Arundel Castle and the Royal Pavilion in Brighton as I had doing anything that resembled business. But, we got to meet these people, and they were nice, and some of them were really talented, and Brian in particular drew in a style that was very, very American influenced and at the same time very cutting edge for what America was at that time. So that was kind of an easy connection between him and I think particularly Len, who was editing at that time.
So was it a case of then Brian introducing you to these the other names that? Came over?
We went through several stages. I mean, the first was sort of one connection leading to another, as you say. Part of it was occasionally people would pop up looking for work. I mean, one of the most vivid memories I have is coming back to my apartment in Greenwich Village, opening the mail one day to a letter. Hi, you don't know who I am, but I'm the best comics writer in England, and I'm writing you because I think you're one of the better comic book writers in America, and if you ever need anybody to write The Martian Manhunter, I'd be happy to do that. Signed, Alan Moore.
Yeah, I was waiting for his name to come up at some point.
It was a little longer than that, Alan. But it wasn't
About
really
18 pages.
No, it was about, as I remembered, it was maybe a page typed in the process. And Alan had written, up until that point, I think the only thing he'd had out in 2000 AD was a strip called Skiz, which would not necessarily be evidence of the Alan Moore, the genius who we have come to know and adore and respect. It was a kind of nice E.T.-ish kind of knockoff. It was better written probably than most of what I've ever done in my career, but it was not nearly as well written as Alan Moore.
Well, it does. I mean, his work certainly casts a significant shadow, not only to this day, but in terms of sales numbers, in terms of what he's... we're talking about Watchmen here, certainly in particular, but certainly in the way that Alan works. I mean, Kieran, I think this is where I bring you on this one. I mean, whether you admit it or not, you are producing something in The Wicked and Divine which aspires to that level of literacy of Watchmen and of Alan's work. How important was Watchmen to you as a young reader?
I like to think that we rip off Watchmen every day. I'm a big fan of the word I prefer ripping off and inspired, because ripping off is speaks to the disrespect I think a lot of the material I liked have. You talk about the anger of the period. I quite like saying ripped off rather than inspired. There's less politeness there. But no, Watchmen was enormous. I mean, the weird thing for me, of course, I'm someone I'm on this panel because I was informed by this. I think a lot of my primary influences are of this period. And I came to comics really late. I came to comics in 97 in terms of being really into comics. Actually, that's a lie. I got into comics properly in 2000. I got into Alan Moore in 97. And the period, of course, there was no comic shops where I was from in Stafford, so the American books were like very alien. So I was reading like stuff like Battle and like bits of 2000 AD, and some stuff like that. I picked up Action a lot later. But I was primarily aware of the British invasion happening via the music magazines and the video game magazines, because they had culture columns. They wrote about things that weren't the topic. Sure. So I was aware that if they were available, I should probably read Watchmen. I should probably read V. I should probably read martial law. Because it was covered as a serious thing worth reading. So basically, the first time I ever saw a copy of Watchmen in the flesh was literally 97. I was waiting for I was trying to get basically a visa to work in America for a year, and I was basically waiting them to fill it in, and I went to Oxford Street, picked this copy up, and basically read Watchmen for cover to cover in 3 hours because I was waiting for the visa, and that was fundamentally one of those road to Damascus moments. But I lived in America for a year, and the first month I didn't have a TV. I had a load of existentialist texts and Watchmen, and I was too depressed to read all this existentialism, and so so Watchmen's the least depressing option in my house.
And yet you're alive today. It's really impressive.
But that was the way the structurals, and so I read it again and again and again. Wow. And every time you read Watchmen, I mean, there's a video of me online. I did a kind of speech about an hour talking about Watchmen and structuralism and how it works. And, what I learned and what I rip off from that. And that was it. It was that kind of that thing. I
Yeah.
just really went into this as a literary and as a structural device. And years down the line, I use as the basis of my thing. I tend to write to be reread, which I think is a lot of these kind of a lot of this material was written like that.
Sure.
So,
A lot of certainly Alan's and Neil's.
Well, I mean, David, you
some
worked with
grants.
Alan on V for Vendetta. What was your and Alan's attitude to the American comic scene? I mean, was there a sense of challenge, a sense of awe, perhaps, or was it a sense of an intimidation, perhaps? What was your feeling about the market across the pond, as it were?
I can't really speak for Alan. Alan had a love affair with American comics, and he knew more about American comics than me. He knew all about DC. He knew about all the editors. He really loved what American comics represented. For me, I mean, my attitude to American comics was at that time that we were doing V, the end of the 70s and the beginning, that I really thought American comics were weren't really exploring as widely as they could. I mean, you just heard Paul say that they were, they had a limited sort of like creative viewpoint. And when we did V, we wanted to really bust out and do something completely different. I mean, which we did. There was nothing like V around at the time, and nothing like V after it, really. So my attitude was kind of different, but Alan was a great devotee of American comics, and as you see from that letter he wrote to Paul, he really wanted to work for American comics, and he did successfully. I mean, I think obviously his time on Swamp Thing was groundbreaking, and that was for me that was like seminal moment. I mean, if you're looking for a point at which the British invasion happens, it's then.
It's seminal for that. It's seminal for the degree to which it changed American comics' attitude about what we could do ourselves. Alan took on subject matter that nobody had remotely dared to think about putting in American comics up until that time. And we were at an interesting moment because the comic shops were growing at a good pace. They were becoming clearly the future of what our business was going to be, which meant we were going to have an older reader, a more sophisticated one, but we didn't really have a writing staff with a proven skill at reaching an older audience and a lot of practice at doing that. And when you talked earlier about both the cynical and political tone, the group of writers who were dominating American comics at that time were largely not political people, were largely not vastly philosophical or literary. There were a couple guys, Steve Gerber, Don McGregor, who had literary ambition beyond what the medium was capable of doing. And we had some wonderful writers like Len Wein. It would be a great example, writing in the traditional material, but just writing really well. But what Alan was doing was just unrelated to what anybody had seen before.
I think for myself, I mean, the groundbreaking moment as a personal reader was that moment of seeing Watchmen on the Times most influential books list, on the bestseller list, when it transcended comics and turned into literacy and turned into important, influential works.
But Watchmen doesn't really do that for a long time.
No.
It's very, when it comes out as a maxi series, it's very well regarded within comics, but it doesn't sell like Dark Knight.
No.
Its sales were just over 100,000, maybe 125,000 copies. To Dark Knight was around probably 300 or 350,000 copies at a much higher price point at about the same period. Doesn't sell anywhere near X-Men, which is selling 400,000 copies every month at that point. Chris's work is vastly more commercial.
Sure.
But in the same way that Contract with God a decade before had influenced creators, including Alan, to say, "Oh my God, this doesn't have to just be fish wrap." Or in British terms, I guess it's chip wrap.
No, fish and chip wrap.
Fish and chip wrap. We don't wrap our chips that way.
No.
I'm really you
here.
make me really hungry.
You are so screwed around here, Karen. I'm so sorry. We used to have a nice fish and chips place right across the way, but they've knocked that down along with everything else in San Diego. But Will inspires Alan, Neil, Frank, a whole group of people to believe that the medium can change. Alan then shows you can do it even in the periodical comics.
Sure.
And that's really that first inflection point. Watchmen does achieve everything you say,
Yeah.
but achieves it over
It takes
a very long period of time for us to get there with it.
Could I just say something? Somebody else say something about Swamp Thing while we're talking about it. The comics code was ditched during Swamp Thing.
Yep.
Because Dick Giornato took the decision. Well, that's it. We're going to get rid of the comics code because it's actually stopping us showing the stuff. And that was a real important moment.
Got to give Jeanette Kahn the credit with Dick on that. And that was one of the actually most difficult meetings I ever had in my career when I was sent into the Comics Code board that I sat on to try and argue that we should, that we were going to take the symbol off that and that we should try to go to some kind of motion picture-like rating system, which the Archie guys were having heart attacks on the floor. But one of the long-term disagreements, and reasonable disagreements between Marvel and DC in those years, Jim Galton, who was running Marvel Comics, was utterly decent man and basically decent to creative people his whole career. But he believed he was selling characters, not creative people, and not story content in the same fashion. He thought it was still a kid's business. And he was totally against the idea of a rating system and totally against what we were doing there. You know, it's fine if you want to publish something for an older audience, but don't make it look like a comic book. You know, sort of get it out of here. Was a very challenging couple hours.
I mean, we can also talk about some other influential names of the invasion, such as Grant Morrison, Peter Milligan, Neil Gaiman, who is at Comic-Con, and heaven knows I tried to get him in the room, but obviously he's very busy promoting his adaptation of American Gods. God knows I tried to get him in the room. But was there a sense of this British talent writing for American publishers, kind of prodding the hornet's nest and shaking things up? Or was it intended to be more like a more civil union, as it were?
Well, from the DC standpoint, and we were the most aggressive company at that point pursuing the British talent, we were trying to change the emphasis of our line to take advantage of the growth in the direct market. Marvel had a much better market share than we had in those days, and we saw that as our engine to grow. It was kind of looking at Alan and saying, are there any more at home like that? And Jeanette and Dick took several trips a year for a while to England. And Karen Berger, who was a young, very new editor, I had hired her a couple of years before as my assistant, got as her responsibility, would you take care of this British stuff? And she was technically appointed British liaison because it was confusing, these funny pound things that you had to pay in, and it was difficult getting material back and forth, and apparently the only way you could have a constructive conversation with the British creative talent was in the bar after about the 7th beer. And
it wasn't necessarily a cohesive conversation,
but it was effective, I'm told. And Jeanette was not a big drinker, and Dick's drink of choice was Sweet Rob Roy's Straight Up. So Karen was sent to be able to manage this. And she started coming back with all these people. We were, at the beginning, hunting the artists much more than the writers.
Yeah.
A lot of our older artists were starting to fade out of the business. So this was, okay, who's going to be the next Kurt Swan? Who's going to be the next Irv Novick? Starting to find it. But she kept coming back with these writers. this young kid, Grant Morrison. I remember the first poster we did with him had some kind of fucking lamp on his head that he was doing as though he'd had the 7 beers and it was a party and it was time to make a fool of himself.
I need to add something to that. I mean,
Please.
You're right about the temptation factor, and the British writers did need some seduction. But I just want to add, the important thing, we wouldn't sell ourselves for too little bread. The thing is this, I was lucky enough to be involved with sort of like hosting Dick Giordano and Joe Orlando in one of their trips to Britain. I was the chairman of something called the Society of Strip Illustration.
Right.
And we had these regular meetings, and Joe Orlando and Dick Giordano came along to one of those and spoke about what they wanted, spoke about their needs for artists and writers, because they, as Paul says, they appreciated what we were doing here. On top of that, the big moment, though, of getting everybody happily involved was something that I should tell you about, which is a dinner at the Savoy. Now, I don't know how much any of you know about London hospitality, but the Savoy Hotel is one of the best in the world, if not in London. And we were all invited by Karen and Dick and everyone to a dinner at the Savoy. That involved me, Jamie Delano, John Wagner, and a whole bunch of other people, including myself. And at that time, you were lucky to get a pub lunch from the British publishers. So, to add to what Paul's saying about, treating British talent the way it should be deserved, it was that kind of seduction and that weight of seduction that spoke to us about their commitment to us. And that was very, very important because, when you get something like that, it's incredibly impressive. And it makes you realize there are people out there who really want you to work for them. And, from that point on, that's when I started working for DC. I did a series of short stories for Wasteland, which was one of those great anthologies that were being produced at the time by DC. So that was my first entry point. That was a really important moment. You really need to believe that a company wants you. When, as I say, we had been neglected. Yeah. We had been treated badly by our British publishers. And this goes actually way back, because one of the great British artists of all time, who's no longer with us, is a guy called Don Lawrence. And Don Lawrence used to do this fantastic strip called The Trigun Empire for a magazine called Look and Learn. This goes way back. Don went to the publisher because he just needed a pay rise. He was doing incredible work. And he went to the publisher and said, "Look, I just need a pay rise." And the publisher wouldn't give him. He said, "No, we can't. We're not going to give you any money. You're just a comic artist, basically." Along came a guy from Holland who was producing a magazine. I forget what the name of it was, but anyway, he was doing this character called Storm, and he said, "Oh, well, can you come over and do this because we love your work?" Don became so famous from doing that, working for this Dutch publisher, that when he died, they gave him the Knight of the Orange Order. That's a knighthood in Holland. See, and the British publishers think, who in hell? And, at the bottom line, that's why, as well as our love of American comics and what all meant to us, because we were all brought up on those. Yeah. It was the complete negligence of the British comics publishers, which continued. Yeah. And basically, just let me finish by saying that if you look at British comics industry now, which it could have been incredible if it had kept all those creative talents. But it didn't care. And you look at British comics industry now, what have you got? 2000 AD, that's it. Basically, that's it. From a creative point of view, that's it.
Well, that kind of leads on to the next question, which I was going to ask. And
I think there's one important thing here to throw in, and this sort of implicitly be said, what David was saying, but they just paid better as well. It's, DC paid better than what 2008. I know everyone's sort of been dancing around that, but that's important to note.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think actually in constant dollars we paid better, but I think it was the difference at that point between the dollar and the pound that made the shift. But what we did do is we had royalties inherent in it.
Yeah.
And very few people actually earned anything off royalties on the DC books at that point. They weren't selling that phenomenally. But the potential was there. So certainly Brian on Camelot 3000, which should be remembered, that was the first original direct-only book that we did. He was the artist chosen for that as a groundbreaking title. First comic published in America with bleed. I mean, not that, it's sort of a detail in history now, but, the technology was changing radically, and we took advantage of it. All of these things betoken what David was talking about in terms of the subtleties of respect. It was respect for the work. We're going to print your work better. We were shifting in America from printing that was about as shitty as the British printing. I mean, the British material was almost all black and white on horrible newsprint. American comics for a long time had been very bad color on newsprint. We were starting to shift. Camelot was the first thing printed offset as an original series, which just was incredible for the change in the line work that was done. And
was there also a sense of ownership, not necessarily of physical ownership of the work, but the fact that there were the name was being put to the work? Because here, certainly with 2000 AD, no one knew who was writing and
I think 2000 AD had credit.
That changed. It took its time getting there.
Did they return original art at the time at that period in Britain?
That was a thorny
Yes,
subject. I could talk for a long time about that. You don't want me to.
So we were ahead on that stage, and this isn't to say that American comics were perfect in the way they worked with the artists. At that, we aren't now. But we certainly were lapping what was going on in Britain at that stage, and that was sucking all the talent to our side, and it changed American comics enormously.
Well, there was a question because I do want to open up for Q&A at some point, and I do have a thing I want to wrap up on. But there was a question that Paul Jenkins, who was going to join us by Skype, did want to put into the conversation, and I'm going to put this to Kieran as well. And he says, I know there could be this implication that us Brits write comics better than anyone else, that as a country we're just smarter and better at it. That's clearly...
I'm much more humble.
Yeah. That's clearly not the case, obviously. But why do you think we do have such a strong handle on the superhero genre, do you think, Kieran?
Eccentricity. Can I just say eccentricity?
Yeah.
I thought... I'm trying to remember who said this. It strikes me as the sort of thing that Warren Ellis said. Did British creators get laid more when they were teenagers? I think.
Sorry?
Probably couldn't have been less.
Yeah. There's one of the things like just kind of the socio-economic kind of demographic of the comic creator, as in they were often more music people. There were people involved in the counterculture in that kind of way, and there's that kind of fur-by-all nature of influence, as opposed to the more kind of hermetically sealed nature of the American comic book writer.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's true anymore. It's just not true, because this all stuff is there and people kind of take many different influences, and the background comic writers come from now is much, much wider.
Sure.
So, if it was true then, and you could definitely argue some of that, I think any essentialist assumption is a bit tricky.
Yeah.
It's certainly not true anymore.
Yeah. That's why I did say that question came from Paul.
Yeah. It's one of the things, it's like my generation of creators, my peers were often, since I was kind of one of the first generation of internet writers, we got together on the Warren Ellis forum, and we caused trouble there. And it's people like Matt Fraction, Sam Humphries, Kelly Sue, Brian O'Malley, all these people. The people I worked with were international. My peers and the people I argued theory with weren't necessarily guys I were down the pub with. It's definitely more internationalist now, I think.
Okay.
I mean,
Well-
it's telling that we went straight to America. We never went to 2000 AD.
Yeah.
Because we could go to America directly because the internet existed.
Yeah, sure.
You know.
Well, I mean, in that question then, it does ask for people creating here in the UK. I mean, does it still feel like that Marvel and DC and the American comics market is the end game? Or is there still a sense of them and us? Or is it more demographic now? Democracy? Democratized?
I think it's a contiguous market now.
Yeah?
You know, you have Titan publishing a ton of books out of England, but they use a ton of American talent in the
Yes.
process.
Yeah.
You have American publishers using a ton of talent over here. Geography, thanks to the internet, as Kieran was saying, is so much less relevant. It's still a great barrier for writers because it's the language barrier. You're not going to have a lot of people in Turkey who are going to be so fluent in English that they're going to be wonderful writers in English. So there probably are a few, but I open my email in the morning for pages, and there's stuff from my artist that I'm working with in Singapore, and my artist that I'm working with in Turkey, and then my artist that I'm working with in South America, and it's a contiguous market for all of that. And for the ones who are fluent in English, I have the great fortune to be working with Sonny Liu on Dr. Fate. Sonny just did this fabulous graphic novel, The Art of Charlie Chan Hak Chai, which was first published in Singapore by, you can't even call it a small press, a printing press in a corner, but won the literary award as the best novel in Singapore this year, but immediately was picked up in America by Pantheon for distribution to the rest of the English language. Is that an American book? Is that an English book? You know, that one other little story that might amuse the group. One of the odder things I've done in the course of my life was talk with the Dewey Decimal people who organize, theoretically, how libraries are organized when they were starting to figure out what to do with graphic novels. And they originally wanted to have graphic novels by country. And they were looking to do it by what they defined as country of origin. And I got in the conversation about, well, for instance, how do you deal with Alan Moore? Because here's WATCHMEN. It's Alan and Dave. They are, God help us, Brits. It is fundamentally an American graphic novel. The tropes in it, the social theories, the history that's in it is all based on what's gone on in America and on American comics. Yet on the other hand, you want Alan's work together. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Alan, Kevin O'Neill, again, Brits. It's a bad pattern here, but it's a British conversation. It's absolutely a British book. You know, he's probing so deeply into British pulp history for what he's doing. You're going to put those in two separate classifications in two separate sections?
No.
This just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how they ultimately ended up doing it. I think they did manage to keep Alan's stuff together, but God knows what the classification is. Do we have a librarian in memory of that? You only do Library of Congress.
Okay.
Yeah. Came from which place?
Okay.
I mean, me and Jamie have the same problem. I mean, Phonogram and Wicked Divine could not be any more British. They really, like, Phonogram especially is so ludicrously patriarchal.
Yeah.
But yeah, we always in American awards. That kind of, you know, best American comic book, despite the fact is, you know, it really is so stupidly British that, you know, no American would want to read it, surely.
Okay, before I do open it up to Q&A then, I want to just finish on a thought, and this was something that I want to wrap up the panel on. And this is off the back of a comment from Alan Moore and his attitude to comics in recent years. The notable quote of his from 2009, heavily paraphrased, is that of comics no longer being for their original target audience of young kids, and the modern readership now being of emotionally stunted 30 to 40-year-olds clinging onto their childhood. Now, while I resemble that remark, we can't deny that comics today definitely require a level of maturity to appreciate them, I feel. Final Crisis is something I can point to as being particularly dense and complex, as was last year's Convergence for DC. Are we living in Alan Moore's prophecy? And just like V, toppling those first dominoes laid by the influx of British talent, is it ultimately our fault? You think? Or is that just a very, very long sentence?
With all due respect to Alan, and in many ways, I certainly resemble pieces of that remark as a fan reader myself, and my tastes in the comfort food that I love. All the market research that I ever saw us do said that the American comic reader was older. He was right in the age group, perhaps. It was more male in those years, shifting now a bit as the material shifts. But it was an incredibly educated and bright group.
Yeah.
15 or 20% of them had gone to graduate schools. They read in prose 5 or 6 genres regularly. They read 6 times as many books as the average American. Now, admittedly, America is a fairly illiterate country by comparison to Britain. So 6 times as much as the average American is just a modest amount by comparison to some other countries. But it's still, for America, our readers are a pretty bright bunch of people. We never managed to, thank you. It was one of the major marketing problems for comics in America, because when you looked at the demographics of who the readers of comics were in America, they were wonderful, very committed readers, very bright people. God wasn't making many more of them. We were well out on the standard deviations of several different important behaviors. You know, we never did any market research on how emotionally developed our audience was. I can't speak to that. But
No. I was just thinking. The thing I always, whenever you hear an Alan quote, I always remember he's an agent provocateur. He's a bit of a troll. You know, so it's one of those situations where Alan was probably smiling when he said that as well.
Yeah.
You know, that's kind of Alan's interviews a performance. And that's that kind of the degree of, if you actually see him live doing a speech like that,
yeah,
he's being playful as well. So it's one of those situations where you need to...
Where's the he at the bottom of the...
You need to sort of step behind the words and work out
Sure.
why someone would make that statement, as opposed to taking the statement as is. You know what I mean? And that's Alan Moore, you know,
Fair
through.
enough.
You're meant to... It's the start of a conversation rather than the end of one.
Yeah, okay. Tell you what, we have I actually think we could have carried on talking, and I'm kind of glad that we didn't have our contributions from across the pond, because we have run out of time. I think we've got time for perhaps one question from an audience, if you do want to. Back of the room, if that's okay. Yes, sir.
It's not so much a question, just we know Dave Gibbons, so we text him, tell him what's he passed on a quote, and he says, on the theme of the British invasion, he says, it wasn't so much an invasion, but an infiltration, followed by an invitation, followed by infatuation, and possibly insubordination.
that's a nice thing to close on.
And I don't think we can finish on a better line than that. Ladies and gentlemen, can you give my fantastic panelists a round of applause? Thank you very much indeed. Do check out David Lloyd's website, Aces Weekly. Do check out Kieran's work on Wicked Divine. And, of course, just check out Paul Levitt's wherever he is, because he's just worth it. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.